Chapter Excerpt from the soon-to-be-published novel Mouse by Joseph B. Chapter 19. Mouse dreamt. In his dream he was standing above a kind of a pit, as if it had been a strip mine, but abandoned. He was sitting on the edge, feeling comforted by the presence of so many around him, looking down into the pit below, feeling a sense of ease and satisfaction that he was not down there. Or maybe that he was no longer down there, perhaps having just escaped from it. There were people down there. The walls of the pit were steep, as if they had been prison walls, yet through millennia they had eroded and looked somewhat natural, geologic, yet oddly steep and straight. There was an angle in the wall also, and although Mouse was unable to see to the other side of the pit, he had an odd feeling the pit was square-shaped. He looked down into the pit at the people within it with a kind of amusement, flavored with pity. The people there did not know of the high place where he was. They just looked down and walked back and forth. Mouse pondered why he was not trying to help them. There just seemed so many down there, and he was but one person. This wasn't his job, surely, his responsibility. If he'd gotten out of their pit, they could do it too. Mouse just sat and watched. And then he noticed something. Mouse had not been aware of it before, but now he noticed writing on the walls. Some of the inscriptions were misshapen, illegible, or perhaps written in languages he could not recognize. But some he could read. There were names of beers, liquors, brand names, and logos of foods, furniture makers. Here was scrawled what Mouse believed were street nicknames of drugs, heroin, crack. Here was a marijuana leaf etched into the walls. There were syringes strewn about the floor of the pit in one spot. Another empty bottles, another bones of animals, and an enormously obese person asleep nearby. Mouse became aware of nudists in one area, tanning salons, a line of mirrors as if a dressing area for actors, with persons crowding each other for access to the powders and creams, touching up their hair and the reflections beneath bright white lights. Mouse became fascinated at what he saw and scanned the bottom for more details, finding himself jogging along the edge to see better into the foggy distance of the pit, covering some distance. Here were great rows of easy chairs, kicked back with people snoring lazily within them. Here were couples engaged in love-making, totally absorbed and unaware that they were in the open, their mattresses just strewn about the dirty floor of the pit, exchanging partners as one or another pushed them off or rolled away out of weariness, or perhaps boredom, Mouse thought. Mouse saw smokers and great banquets, the smells of exotic foods wafting up to him. There were tailors fitting people with exotic clothing in starched, neat, dark suits with bright ties neatly knotted beneath their throats. Mouse saw them, and easily considered himself above and beyond many of them. But some of the exotic foods and clothing made him wonder, were they somehow above him? He was vaguely aware of a kind of a hunger, yet when he thought about eating the foods he was seeing, a wave of nausea swept over him that puzzled him. That was excellent food and drink, surely. Why then was that not what he wanted? As Mouse rounded one of the great turns in the pit and continued to watch the changing scenes below him, he suddenly became startled by the sight of some of those people in the pit below walking along a kind of a levee bank, looking down into something below even them. Mouse wondered what could be in that pit. It was far smaller than the pit he was watching, and he could easily see all four corners of this yet smaller pit. He amused himself by watching the people below him walking the corners of that yet farther pit. Yet slowly, through a little wandering to find the ideal viewing spot, Mouse was able to discern images of that yet farther pit. The first image that appeared to him was one that he had attached much negativity towards in his struggles. He felt a sense of justice that it was far below, that sign, though some called it a logo, the symbol of the U.S. dollar. With it were the signs of Japanese yen, pesos, euros, and other currencies, although Mouse could not identify them all. The images of the people down there, though there were perhaps a dozen or so, maybe 20, were foggier, but Mouse could see them at slot machines, watching stock market figures, lined up at bank teller windows and counting stacks of coins, bars of gold, sitting guardedly on sacks, wearing gaudy gems, each isolated from the other. Then Mouse felt startled as he realized some of them, only 2 or 3 though, were standing on yet a farther pit, looking down. That pit was but a hole, really, like an old-fashioned well. He could vaguely see the image of what he thought was a head of someone in a crouch, an uncomfortable crouch, looking intently straight down at the floor of his well. Perhaps, Mouse thought, and this was what startled him, perhaps looking down at something beneath him also. There was no adornment on that well wall, as far as Mouse could see, though he thought he could see a glint, a reflection of something. Could it be that that still lower pit, that well, that hole, was lined with a mirror? Mouse shook himself and started to feel that it was not a healthy thing to do to look down like this. He felt it would serve him far better if he were to study his own surroundings instead. Mouse, therefore, in his dream, decided to contemplate himself instead of looking down on others. Where was he? Mouse turned away from the levee bank he'd been walking along, or was it some kind of ancient prison wall? Mouse walked away from it and felt a sense of comfort. He saw many people around him. Many of them were reading, sitting in stoic but comfortable chairs, studying. Some of them looked up at him briefly, giving him a friendly nod, a bit of a comforting smile, and then turning away again. He was in some kind of library, and he was immediately aware of the books on the stacks around him. There were all kinds of political tracts, Mein Kampf, the U.S. Constitution in a large leather binder, a bit ornate, but not gaudy. He found books on Marxism, Huxley's Brave New World, Aristotle's Ethics, and a display case of the Declaration of Independence. The Liberty Bell was there, with a giant flag of the United States above it. He walked past these displays and found himself in a kind of a public market. There were large buildings around him, temples almost, or perhaps courts of justice. People in robes walking back and forth, and he overheard conversations, pieces of legal jargon, political speeches from people standing on boxes, some of them with small crowds of cheering fans waving banners of various political parties. A few of them seemed to know him and call out his name. Mouse seemed puzzled by this and did not recognize them, but they seemed to know him, urging him to come to their group. The Democrats had a corner, the Republicans had another. He recognized Daniel Ortega standing beside Fidel in olive drab, of course, calling out to him in Spanish, "Viva la Revolucion!" He found himself calling to them, and a small group clapped and waved back at him. But they were at some distance, and Mouse did not feel his feet leading himself back to them. He was walking through a colonnade of flags now. Some of them were ancient, not really flags as much as banners, emblems, battle flags. Mouse laughed and stared at wonder at a black pirate flag and wondered if part of his dream had led him to Disneyland, but he felt something uneasy within him that tempered his laughter. His mood grew impatient and serious. He quickly walked past all these flags, feeling that they were some sort of facade covering something more meaningful, covering a distraction, an obstacle. There was a temple in front of him now, Grecian or Roman in design. There was a flame at the top of the steps behind the entrance. Mouse marveled at the weathered columns and wondered how many centuries they must have stood for the marble to become so eroded. There was an old sage in white robes approaching him. His beard was unkempt. He asked Mouse to light a candle and place it at the foot of a statue. "Burn an offering to the luck of Caesar," he urged him. "Mouse," he addressed him by name, "Frederick." Mouse looked into the old man's eyes and felt himself sinking into something deep. "The luck of Caesar," Mouse pondered. "This man knows me." Mouse did nothing but look into the man's eyes for some time. His surroundings seemed to vanish, and he thought he heard cries of thousands of people in pain, thought he smelled the burning of distant fires, sounds of battle. The familiar smell of blood congealed on the ground, stinking in the hot sun. All this he heard, smelled, and felt as he looked into the sage's eyes. He felt a rumble in his legs and feared to look away from the eyes, lest he witness the huge building crumbling around him, threatening him. He felt nervously for the step behind him and felt a sense of ease when he found it. Suddenly the man and his temple were far away. Mouse turned from it, thinking that Caesar had indeed been a very fortunate individual. It could have hurt him little to just burn a candle of him. Yet he felt his business was elsewhere. He turned away, and then looked in amazement at what he saw. There was a huge cliff wall in front of him. There were inscriptions carved into the wall, cave drawings of animals and a hunt, Egyptian hieroglyphs, cuneiform, patriotic slogans. He found the French words to Le Marseillaise, Viva Mexico, and La Raza in Spanish, the battle hymn of the Republic, Dixie, prose in Spanish and French to kings, the English God Save the King, somewhat faded and eroded. He wondered if these were written here to direct him back to where he'd come. Then he wondered about the lower pit, the inscriptions he'd found there. There were many more people here than below, many more in his world. Then he thought about his world. It was larger still, but perhaps still just a pit. What lay beyond it? A larger world, surely. The world of self-absorbed physical comforts had fewer people, as people with that outlook shunned most of the population around them, just accepting those that would help them gain their selfish pleasures. The world below that was material gain, still fewer, as everyone was a competitor, trying to take what they had gained. The world below that was a frightening image of complete self-absorption, shunning everything but reflections of the self. Perhaps something lay even beneath that unfortunate soul, yet why was his world also a prison? Surely capitalism and communism sought to include everyone. Mouse pondered that they each excluded the other, though. But who would be looking down into his world? Who outside this pit was able to look down into each of the others, including everyone, pitying everyone beneath understanding, as if from the outside the limitations and traps into which each of the layers had fallen? Mouse looked up and at first squinted in pain, and was forced to look down again, his eyes tearing from the brightness. Yet after a second and then a third attempt, his eyes grew accustomed to the light, and he could see a towering figure watching him. Mouse tried to focus on him. He was simply dressed jeans and a t-shirt, old worn sneakers. This could have been anyone from his past, Mouse thought, or his future. There was nothing remarkable about him. He was no political leader, no great thinker. He could be his neighbor's neighbor, or the guy at the gas pumps adjacent to his on some typical day of errands, the cashier at the grocery checkout. Mouse marveled at the anticlimactic feeling he got from this person's demeanor. This typical guy is able to see me from above? Understand me from outside the box? Then he realized that the guy was normal size. He was laying on the ground, gesturing at him, reaching towards him, beckoning him, urging him up. Mouse reached and struggled, feeling some weight on his feet, holding him to the floor. "Don't go," he heard clearly from behind him. He turned. The President of the United States was addressing him from behind his podium, as if at a press conference. Bodyguards surrounded him, and Mouse felt a sense of hopelessness. How could he escape the power of this individual? He turned away and looked up at the simple man above him, still reaching, straining towards him, his hand open and outstretched. "No," he heard from behind. Mouse turned again, and there was Daniel Ortega, Fidel Castro, and what could have been Lenin himself. Lenin held the red flag of revolution and beckoned him to take hold of the flag. They looked at him sternly, but Mouse felt irritated now. He just wanted to see what was beyond, to look at them the way he'd looked at so many of the others, lost in their plight. He looked back up. Mouse felt a kind of release from his feet, as if he'd been weightless, or some chains were removed. He found himself easily clasping the outstretched hand, and felt a deep warmth enveloping him, as well as an icy fear of facing the unknown. He could hear the voice of his grandmère and others as he was lifted up. Were they chanting something? The sun was bright, but there was a shadow obscuring the sun that he instinctively moved behind to better see. There was a huge timber in front of him, not unlike a giant sequoia tree, from behind the stranger that now clutched his knee and pulled him onto the earth above his pit. Mouse found himself flat on the ground, afraid to rise, staring at a huge, immense, titanic cross that rose far above him into the clouds, overlooking easily the whole of his pit. There was something falling from the cross. At first, Mouse thought they were dead birds thumping onto the ground, or clods of dirt, but to his horror there were drops of blood, each one a congealed pint or so, landing with a thud, splashing little but staining the earth around him. He felt a wave of terror creeping up his spine as he realized that there was a body on the cross, a living body looking down at him. Of all the world that was visible from that height, his eyes seemed solely directed on Mouse. There was in those eyes the same emotion Mouse had felt when he looked over the pit at that first mirrored well-hole he had seen, a wave of horror and pity at what was the fate of the body therein. There was an understanding also in those eyes, empathy, as if he had been there himself. Mouse remembered he had hesitated to relive the horror that he had felt while entrapped in those lower pits, and had ultimately turned away to avoid doing so, yet this huge entity on the cross could not turn, as Mouse had done, and look away, amusing himself with all the created universe that lay beneath his feet, as Mouse had amused himself in his life with his political theories and discussions. This being could see all, and, if he came down from the cross, could easily fill the pits, entombing them all. Yet he chose to stay there watching, waiting, perhaps hoping. Then Mouse took his eyes off the huge figure that towered into the heavens, so that even the sun and the moon orbited beneath his outstretched arms, and looked around. There were people there. Many of them were watching him, too. Some of them may have been there for 1,000 years or more. Mouse could tell by their age and ease and familiarity with the ground around them. He also noticed their clothing was clean. Others, like Mouse, had a dazed expression, a mournful demeanor, dirt still on their knees and clothing from their ascent. They seemed to come from all ages and cultures, some professional, well-dressed, others no doubt coming from intense poverty, some in furs and clothing made simply from grasses, others in business suits. Mouse noticed they all seemed ordinary. Oddly ordinary, though. Typical, somehow. Not a single famous face among them. Many were chanting something rhythmically. Mouse felt some of the chanting, perhaps singing, was coming from above, far away, as if the stars themselves were musically humming, but with barely discernible syllables unknown to Mouse. The whole world here seemed to be a kind of harmony, a vast vibrating musical chord. Many of the people Mouse noticed with dirty clothes were openly weeping, maybe with joy, maybe with horror. Mouse could not tell, for they seemed blended somehow. The weeping somehow accentuated the music of the place. It fit. Mouse knew that if he faced openly the reality of the amount of time and energy he had spent entrapping himself in that lower pit, he too would break down and weep, for he had not helped anyone from the lower pits, or helped anyone, not even his beloved Daniel Ortega, to accompany him from his confines. He'd only thought of himself. Mouse drove these thoughts from his mind, thinking it better for him just to focus on looking back down where he'd come, and feeling satisfied that he was no longer in the pit, admiring the view, as it were, amusing himself with the surroundings of this new place. But as soon as he thought these thoughts, he felt his feet growing heavy again. His sense of gravity was coming back, and he was sinking into the earth, as if the ground below him had become quicksand. The voices around him were fading. He found himself back on the pit floor. He felt a sense of sadness. His beloved grand-mère had been there. He'd heard her, yet he failed to seek her out. He turned, and Lennon was there, smiling a little, as if he'd passed some test. Mouse felt like he wanted to tell Lennon of what he'd seen, of what he'd come to understand, but then he realized that an eternal name like Lennon, not unlike that of Caesar himself, needed no lessons from his simple, humble mind. Mouse reached for the flag Lennon was holding and looked into his face for comfort. Lennon just grimaced back at him, stern as ever. There was a coldness about Mouse now. The warmth he'd earlier felt was draining from him. At least I'm above some of them, Mouse thought to himself, comforted a bit by the understanding that he had some companions that understood him. At least he was not in that mirrored hole. Mouse awoke. The clock next to him revealed 6:14. His alarm would go off in 1 minute. Mouse hated awakening like this. It happened too frequently. His reflexes were still slow, so he decided to just sit and stare at the clock until the alarm sounded. Then once it started to go off, he just continued to lie there watching another minute tick off, and then another. He finally decided 2 minutes were enough and reached forward and silenced the noise. He sat up in his bed and contemplated his surroundings. The images of the dream were fading, and Mouse wondered what he'd eaten to give him such a wild and vivid experience. The shadows were many, the light dim. He knew he was at home, not at the station. He often awoke disoriented, not sure if he was at a different station. Perhaps he'd worked overtime on another shift, or perhaps he'd crashed at a friend's house after a hard night partying. But such was not the case this morning. He felt unusually alert and aware. He tried not to think about the walls of his abode around him, confining him. He showered, trying to enjoy his leisurely morning rituals. When at the station, he'd learned the hard way to only shower the most important parts, then wash his hair quickly, rinsing as he lathered. Too many times the bells had gone off while he was in the shower, so he'd mastered a 3-minute shower technique and hated it. At home, he deliberately took more time than he needed to compensate, he told himself. He dressed in his boxers and t-shirt, found a pair of socks without too many holes, at least an intact heel, and poured himself a bowl of cereal, noting with disgust that the milk had gone sour. He decided to listen to the news, busy himself with yesterday's paper, or was this the day before? He ate the cereal dry, thoughtlessly leafing through the morning meaningless newspaper. The morning news broadcast was all about the shopping season. 6 more shopping days left, the broadcaster chirped with enthusiasm. Mouse wondered if amphetamines were common for morning news people, then shut off the program and wandered outside. There was an uneasiness he could not shake. The coldness from his dream had stayed with him, even through his hot shower. The morning was coming. The horizon was lit with gold and red hues. Eos, he thought himself, the goddess of the morning, what have you brought for me today? He said a silent prayer to himself, asking for forgiveness for calling upon the name of a pagan god, and then caught himself. Was he praying this morning? When had he done that last? He tried to remember, then remembered his grand-mare's words and guidance from his childhood. It had been a long time since he'd awakened and prayed. He went back inside, a little self-conscious to have been standing outside in only his boxers, staring at the horizon. He went to his dresser and took the beads off the mirror where they'd been hanging, since he absent-mindedly threw them there when he'd moved in. He'd been with his ex then. His life and outlook had been different. He was different, a different Mouse. He thrummed through the beads absent-mindedly. They felt warm for some reason. He was trying to remember the prayers that had gone with them, then realized that the words had been forgotten. He would have to relearn them in English or Spanish. A connection to his ancestors had been broken, and he had done it. He felt he was becoming Americanized, homogenized. He felt sad as he looked at the beads. They'd come from Lourdes, France, probably made in the early days of the 20th century. The world had been different then. There had been no technological wars of death to millions, no atomic bombs dropped on Catholic cathedrals, wiping out monasteries and countless faithful just to get a better surrender terms for the victor, just to make a political point. Yet he had joined that race, hadn't he? His mind was filled with political thinking. If only one party had won the election instead of the other. Yet, what difference would it really have made? What if there was a viable communist party here, as there had been in the 20s? Would that make this a better nation? Or would his mind be filled with anger directed at that party, instead of the one in the White House at this particular period? Were all political theories just part of the pit, a facade? Mouse thought long and hard while staring into the ceiling of his humble little apartment. His truck waited outside, cold and still, the morning dew dripping slowly, a wet puddle encircling the pavement around the tires. He finally noticed the time, 7:25. He'd been idly standing, thinking about nothing for some time, trying not to remember the dream. It was time to dress and get to work. At 7:29, the little truck roared to life. Mouse still buttoning his uniform as he backed out of his little driveway. He turned on the wipers a bit, then his left blinker, checked his mirrors while fastening his safety belt. steered his vehicle the right direction, and sped off into the morning. December 19th.